In a very short span of time, SpaceX has gone from an interesting alternative to NASA's general contractors in order to provide a possibly lower cost transport system up to the ISS and other services. SpaceX was supposed to be one of many vendors, many contractors that would provide access to low Earth orbits and beyond for NASA. And there are, of course, still a wide variety of contractors that do these things. However, in recent times, as all of us know, SpaceX has become, frankly, indispensable, especially when it comes to Crew Dragon. Crew Dragon provides the only access that NASA currently has to the ISS or for human access to low Earth orbit, period. And as a matter of fact, Falcon 9 provides the only access that NASA really realistically has to any destination in the solar system, aside from the few remaining Atlas V rockets that ULA has in its reserves. Aside from that, there is very little that NASA has at its disposal. SpaceX is absolutely essential, completely vital to NASA's operations and to their future, and without it, they would be in a world of hurt right now, as most of us know, given the current situation with Roscosmos. But SpaceX has come through. Time and again, Falcon 9 has proven itself to be an incredibly reliable rocket. Crew Dragon has performed flawlessly. But as we have learned time and again throughout the history of the space program, technology fails. Even the Falcon 9 fails. Now, granted, it has been a considerable amount of time since something like this has happened. However, to assume that something like this will never happen, that Falcon 9 is an invincible product that will never have a problem in the future, or will never have a problem with a Crew Dragon on board, or indeed even that Crew Dragon will perform flawlessly also, is, in my opinion, hubris in the extreme. And in this episode, we're going to explore what would happen if something occurred with Falcon 9 in the nightmare scenario of a Crew Dragon being attached to it at the time. My name is Jordan Wright. I was born in the same year that the human race took its first steps on the surface of another world, and then we promptly betrayed those people's legacy by never going back. But now, over half a century later, there's a new breed of pioneers that are seeking to finish what these people set out to do so long ago. But there is trouble as well, so it's time for commentators like me to stop being polite and start getting angry. Now, obviously, what I'm about to discuss is an extremely unlikely scenario. Thus far, Falcon 9 has proven itself to be as close to flawless as any rocket has ever been. Only the Atlas V has performed better as far as percentage of successful missions are concerned. However, Crew Dragon has not experienced the same amount of success simply because it hasn't flown enough times. I would remind you that the Challenger disaster was the 25th flight of the space shuttle. The previous 24 flights had gone off without a hitch, and Challenger was essentially NASA's workhorse at that time, which had performed absolutely perfectly. What would happen if we had a similar disaster with a Crew Dragon? Well, given what the Russians are doing at the moment, Rogozin would be smiling like a Cheshire cat, no doubt, having zero concern whatsoever for the loss of life, and eager to use Roscosmos's new political power to put the screws to NASA and demand that at least some of the sanctions on the Russian Federation be removed. Otherwise, the crew members on the ISS might suffer the consequences, and NASA would find itself painted into a corner. We'll discuss exactly why that would be the case here in just a moment. But once again, how would something like this possibly happen? Well, I point to one of the few anomalies that the Falcon 9 has experienced back in 2016 when a Falcon 9 exploded on the launch pad while preparing for a static fire of its engines. And unfortunately, the Falcon 9 had its cargo on board at the time, given the high amount of reliability that the Falcon 9 had had up to that point. The Falcon 9 uses a process called load and go, something that is not duplicated by most launch providers, and that is to load up the rocket with fuel in the 45 minutes or so that elapses before a launch takes place. This is something that has caused a great deal of concern with a number of experts in the past, but so far it hasn't created any sort of issue whatsoever. Now, the load and go process is necessary because the Falcon 9 uses a type of cryogenic fuels that warm up a lot more swiftly than other types of fuels that have been used in the past. So if you do the majority of the fueling hours before takeoff, that is to say, before the astronauts board the Crew Dragon, it runs risk of the fuel becoming too warm, something that didn't occur at all with the space shuttle. Now, that being the case, nothing has ever happened that indicates that this process is problematic. Even this particular explosion didn't really happen because of the load and go process, but because of a flaw in a helium tank, at least as far as the investigation's conclusions are concerned. However, it is absolutely necessary that the Falcon 9 use this load and go process. And back in 2016, members of NASA's Space Station Advisory Committee voiced some very strong opposition to this policy, including Air Force Lieutenant General Thomas Stafford, who chaired the advisory committee. He argued that this whole process goes 100% against all of our previous experience in manned spaceflight. That is to say, loading up a rocket with fuel well before you put astronauts anywhere near it, simply because fueling up a rocket is a hazardous process in itself. Now, there are wet rehearsals carried out beforehand with Falcon 9, but here's the issue. The abort system on the Crew Dragon has never been tested from a launch pad explosion. This is the only example that you're looking at right now of a test with the Crew Dragon abort system being used with an exploding Falcon 9. If we had a duplication of the helium tank burst, for example, that occurred in the upper stage of the rocket while crew members were on board Crew Dragon, it might cause some damage to the capsule while it was aborting the mission, and any damage whatsoever might cause other consequences, such as the parachutes failing to open as the Crew Dragon descends. Once again, I'm not talking about likely scenarios. However, here's the simple fact. This has happened with Falcon 9 before. No technology is flawless, and any anomaly that takes place with Falcon 9, even if Crew Dragon is not involved, is going to trigger a very thorough investigation as to the cause of the anomaly before human beings are allowed to go anywhere near the rocket. And the problem is we have no backup whatsoever, which is completely contrary to the whole commercial crew idea in the first place. The whole reason that we contracted two companies to create two different capsules to be used in conjunction with one another is in case something like this took place. But as we all know, SpaceX has risen to the challenge very, very effectively. They have performed, as I've said a number of times, as close to flawlessly as we could imagine. There have been some slight concerns with the parachute system. It has not been operating entirely as designed and entirely as expected. However, even if one of the 4 parachutes fails to deploy entirely, the capsule would still land safely. However, if 2 parachutes were to fail to deploy successfully, that might be a lot more problematic of a situation. Once again, how likely is this scenario? Very unlikely in my opinion, but here's my point. We should not be in this position at all. We should not be 100% reliant on a single company, a single rocket, and a single technological solution for all of our operations in low Earth orbit and beyond. And it's not just Crew Dragon, it's not just the ISS, it's also a huge number of future missions that are going to be using SpaceX rockets. What would happen if SpaceX suddenly became inoperative? That is to say, had some sort of anomaly that required an investigation that drug on for a year or a year and a half. How well would the other launch providers be able to pick up the slack? Well, the answer is pretty terribly. Once again, let's hypothesize for a moment that there's an anomaly with the Falcon 9. Let us further hypothesize that that anomaly takes place where Crew Dragon is put in some kind of jeopardy. None of the astronauts are seriously injured or killed, but they're shaken up, maybe some bumps and bruises, maybe some complications from the extreme G-forces of the abort, but nobody gets seriously hurt. Nevertheless, this would create a serious problem at NASA and an in-depth investigation before they would permit another Crew Dragon to launch. During this time, Atlas V has only 25 rockets left, and all of those rockets are slated for missions that are upcoming. All of the slots, that is to say, for Atlas V are reserved. And even if they weren't, even if ULA decided to transition some of their missions on the Atlas V to the Vulcan Centaur, assuming that eventually it will come into service, the Atlas V cannot carry the Crew Dragon, at least not at present. Some adjustments, modifications would have to be made before Atlas V could reliably carry Crew Dragon up to the ISS. It could certainly be done, but it might take months or perhaps even longer than a year before Atlas V would be ready for this. And keep in mind, Atlas V is using RD-180 engines with almost zero technical support from the Russians. So Atlas V would be the most reliable launch service that we would have at our disposal, and it would be a very limited launch service. Now, maybe Starliner could get in service in time, but the first crewed mission of Starliner will not take place until 2023 at the earliest, and this is assuming that the next uncrewed mission of Starliner takes place without a single hitch, and that's a very, very big assumption. So here's what's going to be happening in the meantime. The clock will begin to run on the ISS. The American astronauts who are currently on the station would find themselves in the unenviable position of having to either give in to Russian demands and get a Soyuz capsule ride back to Earth, or send up another Crew Dragon without an extensive investigation of what caused the first anomaly, something that I can't really see NASA doing, or, and this is the most likely scenario, the American astronauts and Europeans, if there happen to be any up there as well, would remain on ISS, enduring the slow deterioration of their muscle mass and bone mass until ultimately they had a solution to bring them back from ISS ISS. Whether that solution would involve Crew Dragon's Anomaly eventually being discovered and another Crew Dragon being sent to rescue them, or Starliner finally getting into service, or some other sort of solution rather than giving in to Russian demands from Rogozin, who no doubt would be eager to provide help to these poor Americans who need our help. Yes, no doubt he would do that if the United States gave in on an unreasonably long list of demands. Currently, Russia is still providing a ride for NASA astronauts from the ISS, and there seems to be indications that collaboration is going to continue. But if something like this were to occur, if an Anomaly were to take Crew Dragon out of commission for a while, there is no question in my mind that Dmitry Rogozin would use this as a weapon against the United States in order to try to leverage the sanctions. And a serious problem with Falcon 9 would not only impact the whole crew situation on the ISS, it would also seriously impact the matter of resupply. As of right now, Northrop Grumman has sufficient technology and engines from the Russians and the Ukrainians for 2 more launches of their Antares rocket. That's right, 2 launches and they're done, which means 2 more Cygnus resupply vessels to the ISS. After that, Cargo Dragon would be the only solution, again, unless you want to rely on Russian resupply. And another complication that I mentioned in a previous video is the whole issue of reboost. This Cygnus resupply ship that is currently docked with the ISS is the first Cygnus to carry out an attempted reboost of ISS since the test was carried out way back in 2018. And there is no guarantee, by the way, that the modifications that have been made to Cygnus are going to allow for a successful reboost anyway. And in any event, since Antares only has 2 launches left, we really aren't going to be able to rely on Cygnus very much for reboost in the first place. Russia has the United States in a very uncomfortable position if anything happens to SpaceX. Things are not ideal even with SpaceX. When you consider just how reliant NASA is on this one company, you have to wonder how the hell did we get ourselves in this situation in the first place? How did every other launch provider make themselves dependent on the Russians for engines and other pieces of technology? How did NASA allow themselves to get into a position where we had no effective means of transporting astronauts up to low Earth orbit back in 2011, a situation that remained in place for 10 years? And I have to say, Rogozin has a point there. They provided us with a ride for an entire decade for a pretty reasonable price, actually, given the fact that Starliner is going to cost $5 million more per seat than Russia was charging us on the Soyuz. And recently, NASA did the only thing they could do in this situation, and that was to order 3 more commercial crew missions from SpaceX at a price of more than $750 million. They had no other choice. Assuming that all 3 additional flights carry 4 astronauts apiece, we're looking at a per-seat cost of $64.7 million, which is quite a bargain. To be frank, Elon could charge whatever the hell he wanted to and get away with it. I have to admit, he is remaining extremely idealistic about all of this and is frankly being philanthropic given the position he has in terms of negotiating with NASA. They have no other choice but to do business with him, and he is still giving them quite a bargain. By the way, these missions include ground, launch, in-orbit, return and recovery operations, and cargo transportation for each mission, and here's the important part, as well as a lifeboat capability while docked to the International Space Station. Honestly, I think that's an important detail because the lifeboat previously was always the Soyuz capsule. Now, NASA, in my opinion, is making allowances for the possibility that the Russians would not give us access to their Soyuz in case the ISS finds itself on a collision course with a piece of space junk. This is, of course, pure speculation, and indeed this whole scenario of what would happen if there was an anomaly with Falcon 9, all of that is sheer speculation as well, of course, but it doesn't change the fact that we should not be so completely dependent on a single company for all of our solutions in space, and yet that is exactly the situation. It needs to change. We need to get Starliner into operation if that's possible. We need to get Vulcan Centaur off the ground, and we need to get Dream Chaser into operation, and we need to do it quickly. And in the meantime, thank God that all of this didn't happen back in 2016. If you like what I have to say, if you enjoy this content, please support me on Patreon, or there are other methods to do so in the description. I'm on my way to Denver to take a tour of the Sierra Space Facility, speaking of Dream Chaser, by the way, and if you can't do that, just give me a like and subscribe and I will be very grateful. So until we are no longer dependent on a single company, as good as SpaceX is, there needs to be greater diversification, and until that becomes a reality, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.